All right, welcome back everyone to another episode of No Easy Answers, a Marxist podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition. I am here with the esteemed Dr. Richard Barbrook, and he is the author of an essay that he wrote back in the 90s called The Californian Ideology. And this is an essay that I read a few years back and was astonished at the publication date, at the sort of accuracy of the predictions and analysis that was laid forth in this essay. And so it's been coming to mind more and more lately as I've, for some reason, been stewing on the sort of techno-utopianism of the 90s lately. I don't know if I'm 20 years, 25 years late mourning the loss of this sort of 90s optimism. But my mind has been drifting in that direction lately, thinking of kind of like how the world that I was born in no longer exists, sort of thing, So, Dr. Barbrook, I can't thank you enough for joining us and hanging out and talking to me about this stuff. And I wanted to ask you to sort of start by setting the scene of what the sort of political climate was like at the time when you decided to write this piece. Because in my mind, all the kids were graduating at this time and everyone was going to go develop websites and have a job forever because that was like an insatiable market where everyone had to pursue. STEM courses were given a primacy over humanities and liberal arts. And at this time, I think Cops was in its first few series, and America's Home Videos was Bob Saget was still hosting that. And there was this real sort of wind at our back sort of optimism of that technology was going to save us all. But, the 90s, man, it's I've been drifting back to this techno-utopianism. And
so when were you born?
I was born in 83 and I was graduating from high school in 2002. Right. So I was a junior around the time 9/11 happened and interrupted this sort of new American century, and, but I was thinking back to this time and I remember watching The Fall of the Berlin Wall on television when I was a kid, and then, thinking that everyone was going to go to college and everyone was going to develop websites and everyone was going to be a coder, and Fukuyama's end of history is written around this time. The wind is at our back. And it seemed like there was, for liberals at least, it was a really optimistic time. But I'm curious as to...
Well, it was the peak. It was the height of the American empire. I mean,
it was.
Obviously, it came. America won the Second World War by coming out with 50% of the world's manufacturing. Mm-hmm. But it was. I think the triumph in the Cold War was the key moment because it gave that sort of, because the Soviet Union, I'm an old generation, so we grew up with the Soviet Union always being there as well. And it was like the brother enemy, wasn't it? Because the two empires basically propped each other up.
Yeah.
But at the end of it, America came out as the sole thing, and sole empire. And as you say, it was the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama famously said. I actually went to see him speak in London, and somebody got up who knew Alexander Kojev, which he rips off a large part of, and pointed out that Kojev thought the European Union was the end of history because he worked for an early iteration of the European Union.
Right.
He died.
Right. But it wasn't It wasn't.
I could tell you that the key difference, and I've known this because I've been, wrote this 25 years ago with Andy Cameron, is that we were in England, and that's a real difference if you're in Europe than if you're in America, because obviously we have a slightly ambiguous feeling about being inside the American empire. Some people get very enthusiastic about it. They go to Washington, D.C. and see all the big buildings and the imperial architecture and the power of the country, and they just fall in love. One of whom was my father, who was in the Congress for Cultural Freedom and was on the right wing of the Labour Party, the CIA-funded faction, a bit like the people who are in control of the Labour Party now. So there's that side, but there's other people who are, shall we say, more critical about it. And I suppose we came out of that. I mean, my co-writer, Andy Cameron, had been in the Socialist Workers' Party, not the American version, but the Tony Cliff version in England. Been very active in that. Was still very left-wing. I was involved. I was a situationist punk, as we were in late 1970s, and then became very involved in the Labour left in the 1980s. So both of us were Marxist or Trotskyist or whatever. I mean, I am not and never have been a member of a totalitarian party, but we always Amelia of the English left. And we wrote this because we were actually working both at the University of Westminster, and we were setting up an MA in hypermedia studies, which was like the first postgraduate course teaching how to make websites. Also CD-ROM production. That's a blast from the past. And C++ and all these Flash and all these other software. And we needed to write a sort of manifesto for this course, and what sort of inspired us was particularly Andy Cameron that always kept pointing out this is strange thing that you get people who being English and reading The Guardian or whatever would never agree to the privatization of the health service or public utilities and all the rest of it. But as soon as it came to anything to do with the internet or computing, they'd immediately become hardline neoliberals. Market will decide, deregulation, privatization, all the usual mantras of Thatcher, who they claimed to dislike and everything else. And this was because they were reading Wired magazine. And Wired, I mean, it seems strange now, the dead free publication was actually the Bible of this new emerging, because we had the same thing here. I mean, a friend of mine, Ava Pascoe, set up the world's first cyber cafe in Soho in London by accident. Actually, she thought they were copying ones they saw in the Bay Area, but actually they didn't realize it wasn't on the internet. It was on a private network to run the well. But so they just installed the computers and stuck it on the internet, and then discovered, ironically, that they were the first people to do that in a public space, which I think is quite interesting. That was sort of early 1990, and the people who hung around that were, as I said, it was a small business, coffee shop and doing courses on this wonderful new technology of the internet, and famous people like David Bowie turning up there and all the rest of it. But they were most of the people who, when they did a survey of who all the early internet users were in England, The Guardian was their favourite paper by a huge amount. And that's when The Guardian, I mean, it's since become very liberal warmongering newspaper. But at the time, it was the sort of left of centre paper. And so that was really interesting. It wasn't the Daily Telegraph or the Times or any of these other right-wing newspapers. So it was that disjuncture between the neoliberal version of what the internet was and what it actually was, the internet, because it was a mixed economy. And that's one of the key things we pointed out about computing, about California itself. The state played a key role. 40 cents of every taxpayer's dollar in the defense budget went to California. I mean, all the key technologies came out of state-funded research. And again, that was an interesting disjuncture, that the whole Wired and all the people around it, the Nicholas Negroponte, who was in MIT, but Media Lab, but was out funding it, and all the people like the John Perry Barlows and Kevin Kellys and all the rest of it just completely denied all this. They just treated it all heroic entrepreneurs and VCs and the rest of it. And that's something we just pointed out. And then there were other things which they got really upset about, like us pointing out that kept saying on about Jeffersonian democracy, which we thought was ironically appropriate, shall we say. Right. Andy had just finished reading Gore Vidal's Burr, which is suitably caustic about Jefferson as a slaver. I mean, what's interesting now is that actually that's probably the least controversial part of it. But at the time when we wrote it, the Wired crew went absolutely berserk.
Well, yeah, like
Louis de Rossetto, just he was frothing at the mouth about us pointing out that Jefferson owned 400 human beings. I mean, because the problem is now, you're now in the reverse. Being typically American, you go from black to white, and then you can't do the bit in the middle. I say cynically. And now it's the 1619 Project, and he's only an evil slave owner who, sex with a 40-year-old. Whereas the whole point about we were trying to point out that he was both, he was both the great revolutionary and an evil slave
Yeah,
owner at the same time.
and I think at the time when you wrote this, historians still had control over the narrative for Jefferson. It wasn't until like
well, it wasn't very
they were
hard.
losing it, but
Yeah. There's a
yeah,
great book, Wolf by the Ears, which is about his relationship with slavery that I found, and that is just superb. That's really,
yeah,
really good.
yeah.
And about the ambiguities. What's also interesting, when I was a child, when I was about 7, 8, we went to Monticello. And I remember being really impressed by all these things like the dumb waiter, and he had like a copying
Yeah.
machine, and all this sort of stuff. And then they took us to the servants' quarters, which is only many years later I realized this was actually the slave quarters of it.
Yeah.
I assume now it's all being made much more, woke, as they would say these days.
Sure.
Yeah. But as I said, it's interesting that was a bit which, in a sense, now is the least controversial, which was the bit that they really picked on, that they really disliked, and also the stuff about the whole frontier myth that they use. Again, it was really interesting. The Croakers, the one who wrote about the virtual class, and they republished something I later wrote about John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. And in that I put, if this is the electronic frontier, who are the Injuns, spelled INJUNS, as in to point out what it really means. And they changed it to who are the cowboys or the outlaws. Now immerse the outlaws, and I point out again as something that was exactly what we were against, is all this sort of outlaw myth of how America was created.
Well, it's interesting.
That's it. So the history of the internet, the history of America. That's one of the places that we started from, to say the wired ideology, which very much came out, as you said, out of that. America has won. Liberalism is the end of history. We're all going to have representative democracy and free markets, and then everything will be wonderful.
Well, your essay, it's wonderful in the way that you pull from these this sort of American mythology as you compare the rogue sort of hacker to, the sort of lone cowboy sort of aesthetic, the libertarian individualist that has sort of struck a deal with the system they just have to pursue their own sort of individualistic pursuits in order to achieve any sort of happiness or prosperity. They've just bought into the system, and the way that
they're not the denial that they're living in a society. That's right. The curious thing has always been about certainly the late last 100 years or so of classical type liberal, neoliberal, is the denial that you're in a society. If you think of the liberalism of Jefferson, for instance, they would have seen themselves, yes, as individual property owners, or owning his slave plantation and 400 people, but they would also have seen themselves as citizens of a republic. They were both bourgeois et citoyen, as they would say. Marx would have said in the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. And that bit, the concept of citizenship is interesting, that sort of disappeared. I think partly because it was seen as socialist, communist, or particularly during the Cold War. It's dangerous, this idea that anybody forms into collectives like parties and trade unions and cooperatives and community groups. So I think that's partly why, if you look at someone like Friedrich Hayek, he says, Margaret Thatcher famously paraphrased the Constitution of Liberty, there's no such thing as society, only individuals and their family. And I think that view is very much tied with Wired and the people around it. Or, the other interesting is the way that people like Howard Rheingold, who wrote The Virtual Community, actually see the internet as a substitute for what neoliberalism has created. Everybody's atomized in their suburban house, and they're all just driving individually to the office, and they all don't know anybody. No, they don't know their neighbors, and they don't know their workmates. And somehow in the well, you will find that lost community of America of the past, and pre-suburban America.
Right. So you pull from this. I think of, going back to the lone hacker thing around this time. There's like There's the movie Hackers. There's like Johnny
Kevin Mitnick, who was the great hero at the time of hacking into various things. And Cyberpunk, of course.
And Cyberpunk, and Johnny Mnemonic, I want to say as well. And then that character was kind of like, I feel like it was almost the same character Keanu Reeves did all the way up in the Matrix in a way. It's like it's a very similar sort of thing, right?
They shamelessly ripped off.
Yeah.
Everybody from Baudrillard to Gibson.
Totally. And I just,
what's interesting is they've never made Wachowskis have only made one good film. I mean, they really, it's really interesting how sometimes filmmakers are like musicians. They have one hit.
Yeah.
Because I tried to watch the other Matrixes, and they were dreadful. They were. I sat there watching Matrix. I was like, how can you had made the first film so well and then the second film so badly?
Right,
and then somebody many years later sent me this piece about they were also out of their heads on drugs, having made money, and their weird, all their voyage of sexual discoveries. That the films were just completely secondary by that point. Just had lots of money to blow on special effects. So it's really that type. But that's that's an interesting thing where you can melange lots of things together. And it's the one great thing I love about that movie, and it goes back to the Californian ideology, is that they picked up on this thing from their course at UCLA where they were taught Baudrillard, where he says postmodernism is a perpetual present. And they say, what is the perpetual present? It's 1999. It's that moment of the peak of the empire.
Right.
As we go further and further away, 1999 is more and more perfect. That's the fantasy, that we're still there.
Yeah, and I think about this was not a happy time for Marxists, though, man. I mean, all this optimism was, I think, shared by liberals, but for the Marxists,
well,
right?
I think you were a bit young to remember the Cold War. You see, I grew up. When I was at university, we used to buy speed off these U.S. Air Force pilots who were based in East Anglia. And which was very good, because we were punk rockers and you needed to jump up and down to loud music. And then we realised that they were flying above us with nuclear weapons on this stuff, because they had to stay awake for 24 hours, and they were doing like wingtip to wingtip patrols to go against the Soviet. And you suddenly realised that one of them might just sort of miss the air. The runway and go off the end and blow up most of East Anglia in the process.
Wow.
So there was all that great relief. I mean, also, you've got, some drunken Russian might do the same thing accidentally, start World War III. So there was this. I will say on the left there was this sort of great relief on one level, that just because the Cold War was over. And I was working with people like Solidarnosc in the 1980s. The lefties all got shafted after 1989. So there was that moment of hope also on the left, that it wouldn't actually just lead to neoliberalism and disaster capitalism, which is what it did do, obviously. And I've been to the Soviet Union in 87, I think it was. Yeah, 87. Because I worked one of these Polish comrades. She went back so she was over here immediately after the coup, when they had the coup against Solidarnosc. And then three years later, in 84, she went back to see her parents and friends, and they didn't touch her, even though they knew she was active in the exile group here. And I remember her, when she returned, she said to me, "It's all over." She said, "No one believes that Stalinism can continue. No one's joining the party. There's a youth movement is non-existent, and it will eventually collapse. And once Poland goes, the whole system will come down." And she was right. That's one of the reasons we went there in 87, because I got paid off from this job. And I thought I better go there before it disappears.
Yeah.
I was very and we went there, and it was you could sort of smell that it was in a really severe problem, because it was, what was funny about the Soviet Union is it was like it obviously had a very good Second World War, and the paradigm has been very successful in rebuilding after the Second World War up to the 60s. But then it got stuck. It didn't know how to make that transition, which is what the Chinese learned from, of course. They took the warning,
right,
and successfully managed to come out the other end of it. But it was, I remember this guy who was like, we just talking to tour guides and people like that, because you can really talk to the ordinary people. And this guy said, we don't need perestroika, that's reconstruction. He said, what destruction? You think, well, that's a bad sign. That's what the tour guides are telling the tourists.
So speaking about the USSR,
so I think,
though,
to go back to the left, I just want to finish. Let's circle back to the Californian ideology. So in a way, what we were looking at, or we were trying to say, is that the baby had been thrown out with the bathwater, in a way, because it was, to partly to say, look, even America is social democratic to a certain extent. I mean, okay, they came out of the Cold War, but a lot of it comes also out of the New Deal. And also that the way that the New Left, I mean, well, I was right in the sense that it appealed to that, its psychedelic style and all the rest of it, and the fact that it had Howard Rheingold on board, and most of its editors seem to have taken acid at some point. But there was something out of that cult, their generation, which they themselves weren't particularly into, but the whole New Left experience, which definitely did impact into the internet and also into the culture in general. Women's rights, lesbian, gay rights.
Sure.
This idea that we could look at different communities and try and unite the class over its prejudices, overcome its prejudices. That definitely was, and the idea of do it yourself. Which I think is really important. Don't rely on the bureaucrats to set it all up for you. You have to get it. So there was all that positive side. So we wanted to say those two things. And then at the end, we pointed out that actually the internet wasn't the first mass packet switching network. It was actually Minitel in France, which was a government scheme, basically. And I'd used it when I visiting there in the mid-'80s. And I actually booked a train ticket in 1985. On Minitel, which was a long time. Yeah, we couldn't pay online, but you could book it and turn up, and if you arrived, 20 minutes early, they wouldn't sell it on.
Wow.
So that was quite impressive. I was so impressed. I thought this was the future. This was
right. I mean, so you asked the question in your essay, and I'll quote you here, where it's like, who would have thought 30 years after the battle for people's parks, squares and hippies would together create the Californian ideology? And then a little bit further, you point to like a failure of renewal of the radical hippies as the reason why like squares and hippies even came together to form this ideology.
Well, when I was doing my PhD, I spent a summer in 1981 in the Bay Area before you were born. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I had some friends living there, and I went basically to sit in UCB library basically for the summer. And I met quite a lot of people there who were really interesting. One of whom was this woman who'd been at San Francisco University, and she'd been involved in anti-Vietnam War invasion, protests. And Ronald Reagan had sent the tanks in against them, literally tanks. Mm-hmm. To crush the shit. So that and then I met other people. I met this guy who'd taken acid with Steve Jobs, and he was telling me about their peer group and how some of them had gone off to Silicon Valley and made lots of money, and were now taking mountains of cocaine and had large cars and yachts and all the rest of it. And then the rest of them were all actually not. Had become like school teachers and welfare workers, and that had been their response actually from hippiedom. Actually, was to go down that road, and he just said it was really amazing, that sort of divergence. So actually, that I did learn from that how actually those people who went into Silicon Valley were actually quite a small minority, I think, of that group. And also the way that what I also found was quite interesting is how people had gone through everything. They'd done, free love and hippie communes and strange religions and Maoist sects and everything, and they just sort of drifted between them all, and falling in with the sort of whole Earth catalogue, wired type people was the sort of that they're only one section. I mean, Fred Turner wrote a really good book about from counterculture to cyberculture, about this new, what he calls the new communists, who are the so definitely not socialist part of that generation, and who are really the key group behind the whole wired phenomenon. and Global Business Network and all the rest of them. But of course, it's much more. Ours is just a short article, and we were just doing a very broad brush, analysis, mainly for Europeans, of course.
Sure.
And so we just generally call them the New Left, where actually, of course, as he points out, that particular group would not really have seen themselves as left. And I met people like John Perry Barlow later on, and he definitely was on the left. I mean, he was a Wyoming rancher. He was Dick Cheney's campaign manager for Senate.
What the hell, man? Yeah, dude. But
originally he did say that no one should let Dick Cheney near any power whatsoever. But I said,
yeah, no. So I mean, I just wonder, the hippies and the squares came together, but you point to one of the reasons, I guess, of the hippies and squares even being able to come together is a failure of renewal of the sort of anti-war movement, or the hippies at that point, right?
I think that what we didn't point out, the way that the New Left divorced itself from the rest of the left. So they looked down on trade unionists, for instance.
Right.
And then the usual problem, we have the same problem in the Labour Party here, is, do you work within the Democratic Party or do you work against the Democratic Party?
Right.
It's if you have first past the post electoral system. And you've also got your appalling constitution to deal with.
Yes, we do.
The slave owners' constitution.
It's awful, yeah.
Which as they wrote in the Federalist Papers, is designed to stop any democracy working, even if you give votes to lots of people. It's like they're quite open about it.
So, but your essay got me thinking really deeply about technological determinism, and it seems like the people who were on the forefront of this, who felt like they were building a sort of new America, it seemed like they felt they were constructing the scaffolding of a new sort of direct democracy.
Yeah.
And so the direct democracy I've read about now is more entwined with modern technology. So I'm wondering, what did direct democracy being built appear as at this time?
I think you have to understand that they won in, I think it's even in the first edition of one, it said patron saint Marshall McLuhan.
Right.
So a few years earlier, I'd been teaching communication studies at London College of Printing, as it then was called, and I put it on. I was teaching this course based on my first book, Media Freedom, and I had one session on McLuhan, right? And this student came back to me and said, "There are no Marshall McLuhan books in the library."
Yeah.
And I went, "That's amazing." I just went, wow. They had Baudrillard, who shamelessly stole from Marshall, and lots of other French people. We've got McLuhanism. So they were, so they have this idea, which is absolutely central, which is this, concept that, it's not just technological determinism, it's media technological determinism. The self-expansion as capital, as fixed capital in the form of the convergence of media, telecommunications and computing into the nets, basically. And McLuhan got this really early on. I wrote another book, which you might be interested in, called Imaginary Futures.
Cool.
Thinking Machines to the Global Village. And it's very much looking at the origins of this. I did a lot of research into it. I was just curious about the internet, about why they spent so much money developing the internet, because the usual story that in the Katie, Helper book or whatever it's called, Wizards Stay Up at Night, I'm trying to think what it was called, is that it's designed as a communication system that will survive a nuclear war. And that just seemed to me ridiculous, because you wouldn't replace cheap, reliable switches with expensive, flaky mainframe. It was obviously a fairy story. So the question is why? And then by digging backwards, I discovered that actually they got very frightened, because there was this group of people in the Soviet Union, the cybernetic communists, who thought they could basically solve the problems of Stalinism by replacing the market with a computer and, in square brackets, the state, the vanguard party.
But there was also Allende in the 70s with that too.
Them. Yeah, that scared the Americans, and so they then start. There'd been a bomber gap and a missile gap, and then they said, "Oh, there's a cybernetics gap, so we've got to pump all this money into ARPA to make the internet."
Are you telling me the internet was born out of anti-communism? Like,
oh yeah, definitely.
okay.
It's the American road to communism, actually, in a very bizarre way.
Right, right, right. It's
Well, I made this joke once which became another essay called "Cyber Communist Men," which is the Americans invented the only working model, or U.S. military invented the only working model of communism in human history. It's called the internet. But that's so that was very much so all this money went in, and they had to think they needed another theory other than sort of vulgar Marxism or Stalinist Mark, whatever you. So they discovered Marshall McLuhan, and Marshall McLuhan had this theory. So in 1964, in the American Cybernetics Society, had this meeting, and they had this guy called John F. Ford from Georgetown University, who's obviously, if he's at Georgetown, connected with the CIA, saying, we've got to have this competition to get to the internet first. And then McLuhan comes along and basically said, I've got the theory. We've got the theory. We had it was oral culture, then there was printing, capitalism, nationalism, individualism, and then the next stage is the global village, which is the tribal drum. And the global village, he means literally, it's global, as in everybody everywhere becomes America, and it's a village. It reinvents the intimacy of the village, and so that the prediction of the virtual community many years later is in that particular book, or he's understanding media and all the lectures he gives around that period. And then of course he gives that paradigm that you can now say, well, one of the problems in the 1960s is you could say America is a very developed version, a very advanced version of the old society of capitalism, whereas the Soviet Union is a sort of impoverished version of the next society, which is socialism. And now they could invert it, because they could now say, well, we have another stage called the global village, and actually America is ahead. It's like nearer to it owns the future, basically, unlike the Soviet Union. And this was really important in the Cold War to actually say, if you own time, you control space. And it's interesting, if you look now with the whole competition with China, you can see that. The way that suddenly that China looks like the future in a way that America doesn't. They just show pictures of the underground in Chinese cities compared to New York, or anything like and talk about how they can't use 5G phones, or oh my God, look, they're still using cash and checks.
Right.
That sort of thing. And it's very much that sort of thing that America, because again, you have to understand America was much more advanced than the rest of the world. I lived there as a child when I was like 6, 7. My mother remembers, fridges were 3 times as big, and they had color televisions, and everything was bigger and better than Europe. People were like 2 or 3 times richer than Europeans. So that again, the Californian ideology is coasting off that, and the sort of affirmation that particular society, having won the Cold War, is the only version of the future. I mean, Margaret Thatcher said there is no alternative.
Well, it brings up, like, we've had some discussions on the show about the theorist or the French architect Paul Virilio.
Yeah.
And like,
they can't tell the difference between speed and velocity.
Speed and politics, and the thing that you bring up for me is like the concept of the absolute weapon and air domination, and how he characterizes like the last 150 years as like a quest for like air dominance, and it makes me think of the internet as to like air dominance is like if the quest out of the Cold War was to develop the absolute weapon, perhaps we could characterize the internet and that technology as like the absolute phone or something that Virilio kind of character. But I just mean to say, like, that's really I had not thought about.
Virilio is very, very influenced by McLuhan. Like lots.
Wow.
McLuhan
Okay.
Was a lot of French postmodernists, of which he's sort of a member of, were influenced by this, because it gave. Again, we're going back to the hippie generation. Obviously, one of the key things they were involved with was activism around culture, and therefore new technologies, whether it's like video or community radio or rock music. It doesn't really, alternative films. All these things become connected with McLuhan, because McLuhan is saying, well, actually what you're doing is you're pioneering the new society, the global village. And of course, the great thing about him, he was a sort of Catholic, middle-aged English literature professor in Canada. So he has that sort of suitably tweedy look, as they would say at the time. And he's basically bigging up the most wild hippie fantasies about happenings as the future.
And it's interesting to me because where you talk about how there are disparate groups of like libertarian individualists and radical hippies, but their shared common belief in like technological determinism creates a sort of split there. Yeah. Whereas like some of them embrace it.
And you don't need mass collective action. That's the key thing. You don't need the general strike or a stunning election victory or
it definitely
insurrection. What you need is to basically rely on the technology, just appropriating the technology coming out of corporate capitalism and reconfiguring it, bricolage, as Roland Barthes would say. Yeah, right. and you just reappropriate it, and also the fact that its inner meaning is actually liberating, emancipatory. Even though it's produced by these institutions that you don't like, you can see why the empire would promote it in a way.
Yeah, I'm dying to ask you actually what you think about you mentioned how the machines have become the machines of dominance in your essay, and I just wanted to. Like, what do you think about this ChatGPT out here writing poetry and creating art while we're still toiling for wages?
Well, man? I'm sure when they need the next round of IPOs, they'll all be AI, won't they?
Oh God,
I don't think that's actually really. I mean, it's interesting. I kept thinking it's great. It's finally, if it breaks the tyranny of having to mark essays, it will liberate teachers all over the world. If they're all, because everyone just writes the same standard essay, and if you could just get the computer to slightly alter it so it would get past all the plagiarism software, it would basically force them to go back to the sort of medieval technique of actually quizzing people about whether or not they actually really know something.
Yeah.
It would destroy the mass production, Fordist reorganization of higher education overnight.
Yeah, so when you talk about these disparate groups and like some of them embrace like scientific progress as a sort of like unfolding naturalism, but some of them actually like this sort of vision of ecotopia or this sort of utopia could only be achieved by turning away from technology towards a sort of naturalism. And I wonder if you could maybe speak to like those hippies because that concept of like rejecting the modern and instead pursuing what one sees as more naturalist ends.
But isn't that sort of the people around Wired? They were interested because they tried to do both. So they're originally the Whole Earth catalog.
They were originally the Whole Earth catalog.
Yeah.
Wow.
You come across, it's got that famous picture taken from the moon of Earth. Okay. We're all one Earth, man. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
And then it has inside. It was like a Sears and Roebuck catalog for 19th century, Western pioneers, because it's got all the stuff inside you need for your hippie commune. Yeah. And it's all this old technology as well, sort of.
Wow, man. Wow.
And and then they became, through various iterations, the Well, which then become Wired. So they can be both. That's what I think is really interesting. They can be sort of whole food, natural, and they can also be corporate high tech at the same time. And in a way, of course, the Whole Earth catalog is a sort of consumer catalog, even though it's a sort of lifestyle. And again, I think the thing we probably think about in retrospect is what it's not, which is it's not Fred Hampton, It's not anybody trying to actually create radical social change within America. It's an individualist or small group of people dropping out or making it within the system. So this idea that you could have, a mass party change it, well, that all went out the window. You think up to the 1960s, the idea was to somehow get rid of the Dixiecrats and the Democratic Party and turn it into a European Workers' Party, the Social Democratic Party. I mean, in a sense, the Bernie movement was very much carrying on that idea. Michael Harrington being rediscovered. Not sure how realistic it is, given that they all went and recently voted for an imperialist war in Europe. I don't know, but there was that vision around the 60s, and the trade getting the trade union away, movement away from all these corrupt bureaucrats, and trying to, and obviously the struggle for democracy. I mean, America only became a democracy in 1965, which is very, very recent, and constitutional reform, all the rest of it, that all went out the window, and it became this lifestyle politics.
Right.
Save the whale, not save the people.
Yeah, right.
Not that I've got anything against whales, but it's just interesting what you put your energy into.
So, I mean, it's remarkable to go back and read this and to see the year that it was published and how accurate it is with its predictions, and I wonder if I think we weren't harsh enough, were we? I mean, you think about it. I mean, it's wild.
We didn't really, we could have said a lot more about the military purpose of the net, because it was obvious at the time that about the whole stuff about surveillance, for instance, which is now a big issue.
Right.
It was developed. It came out of the military-industrial complex. Okay, it went via the universities. But it's part of that Cold War struggle, and I always think I did when I was high school, as you would call it. I did history in my last 2 years at high school, secondary school, where we do this thing called exam called an A level, and we did which is sort of the Renaissance and Reformation. And what's interesting, you have this incredibly brutal civil war in Europe, like a third of the German population die in it. I mean, it's bad as the 20th century, over whether people should be Protestants or Catholics. But at the time, it was incredibly vital. But in retrospect, they look almost exactly the same, the two sides. Right. And one of the things I always think about the Cold War is there was this massive difference made between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, but in many ways they were both industrial civilizations and actually remarkably similar. And so the fact that the CIA and the KGB or the NSA and the Stasi, have lots of things much more in common than they have differences between them, and that's something I think you need. It's something that's worth thinking about. So if we look at something like what they're proclaiming that America is going to become, as you said, direct democracy.
Yeah, I mean,
when the whole constitutional system is based around stopping democracy. I mean, there is that whole, town hall meetings set off the revolution in 1774, 1775. But, certainly by the time the Constitution is implemented, they have no intention of having direct democracy.
Right.
It's got to be, and you can see right up to today, to become a federal politician, you need to have lots and lots of money behind you, unless you're a maverick like Bernie. But he's really unusual, actually, as I said, and even he's pretty compromised.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how you, how you very sort of clearly delineate how the individualism of this sort of ideology erases the thoughts of the collective, about how even like the construction of cyberspace, you say, has become an integral part of the fragmentation of American society into antagonistic, racially determined classes.
And wasn't that
ultimately,
wow. I don't think even that we would have thought possible.
Well, did you ever see the electronic agora being purchased by a lone individual as well? Because I feel like, what part of why I think your essay is a lone
individual. I don't know. Musk is a lone individual. He represents.
Right.
There is that thing, isn't it? I always love this where they always say it's Putin's war, as if he's the only person who counts in Russia, or Xi Jinping controls China. You just think, these are very large countries with very complex political systems. They have to personify. It's partly a short set. So Musk is not just him; it's a low group of people around him. He's got all that cash for a reason.
Yeah. Well, a lot of this stuff, man, is just like, as I was reading it, there's just stuff that's happening every day that I'm picking out of it. That's like, wow, this is just really remarkable. And maybe it's, predictively sort of pessimistic and realist to think that, like, as
Well,
your?
I don't think we were. You see, the funny thing is that when it came out, we published it with this art politics paper called Mute in London, and then it got picked up by this mailing list called Nettime, which is still going actually, and it was a sort of, again, arts, politics, very European, but had quite a lot of American contributors as well. And it then became like a Bible for sort of Europeans. It was seen as anti-American, which actually I found quite shocking, because it wasn't written as an anti-American piece at all. In fact, actually, we went out of our way to say, there's lots of good things about America. I mean, I wouldn't want to live there, to be honest, but but I have a large vinyl collection, of which a sizable percentage is from North America. So it's, I think that's something weird. It was picked up in that way, and I don't think it is, because we tried to end it, because to be honest, we were trying to sell our MA course, to postgraduate students, and so we had to say, well, we can we'll educate the artist engineers, in constructivist style, and they can go out and make the internet in a better way. I had people who did the MA, and it's really funny. This guy came up and said, well, he said, all the software you taught me has gone out of date, but I'm still using words like Fordism and gift economy in my job pitches. Yes. I said, success.
Yeah. Well,
your money's worth, mate.
Yeah. I only have a couple more questions for you, but I wanted to ask you if you could maybe speak to the way that you closed your essay, and when you say now is the time for the rebirth of the modern. And I wonder.
Oh, that was just our anti-postmodernist prejudice. Yeah. Well, it was very fashionable then. It was all part of this sort of, the end of history. Is the abandonment of any pretense at Marxism, or except sort of the words. They quite like, being French. They would like the rhetoric, but they didn't actually understand it.
I wonder if
Deleuze and Guattari is always my favorite, because they use all these phrases, and you think they've never read Capital. They actually don't understand what they just like the jargon, but But They have no idea. They've never read the books.
Does the work of Mark Fisher hold a special place for you?
I saw him speak once. I mean, he was involved with this CCRU up in Warwick with Nick Land and Sadie Plant. Andy knew Sadie quite well when she'd been a photographer, and he'd been involved. And we went up to this Virtual Futures 95 conference, and we wrote out this, in homage of situationism, basic banalities, basically slightly taking the piss out of their techno-utopianism and Deleuze-Guattari fetish. And there was this great something about later someone wrote this report about it, and then they said, and these Marxists ruined the place by sticking up their manifesto on the wall. Oh, yes. And of course, like everything we said about Deleuze-Guattari, it actually turned out to be true, really true. Case of Nick Land, who turned into a strange reactionary of some kind.
Yeah,
and it's equally unreadable. I mean, it's funny because again, I'm the generation where they were the hippie generation. As an old punk, we used to say, "Never trust a hippie." Yeah. And I was involved in the 1980s in community radio, and there was a big free radio movement in the 1980s in France, and Guattari was leader of this one Fréquence Libre, this station in Paris, and I went to visit it, and it was really sad. We really wanted a license, and they had a license, and we arrived at their radio, so it completely abandoned, apart from one raster in the basement playing reggae to keep, as they would say in French, keep the transmitter alight. Right, and it completely collapsed because and then we got talking to this guy, and he said the problem is that they wanted to ideologically vet everybody. It shows things don't change on the new left. And so, they have like rappers. He gave this wonderful story. These rappers came in when hip hop sort of took off in Paris, and they came in from the banlieue, the suburbs, the ghettos, so you call them in America. Mm-hmm. And they were like, they were black and Arab and white, whatever. They were all mixed together, and they come on air, and they just want to do a show, and they actually wanted to vet all their lyrics before they could appear on air in case they said something that was politically incorrect, rather than just thinking, look, this is a really important movement to get behind. But And that just said it all about, if you believe that in the cultural turn and that, words are make the real, of course, what they say is what's important. As we would said at the time, the message is in the bass line.
Oh man.
And that always thought me, and so that's something I think that's one of the reasons. It's just a dig at postmodernism.
Gotcha. I was just wondering, is there
obviously we ended with Saint-Simon, this idea that people, because we were teaching in art college at the time, is that people should be there, to realise that art culture is okay. You have to go out and get a job, but you're part of the wider movement. But you're not superior or a replacement to the movement, as lots of people think they are. Or you could dismiss it, but you're part of it. And as an artist engineer, you should help work for the socialist future.
Well, I think your comments on hippie culture have stuck around for about 30 years now and been incredibly accurate.
Well, I'm not original, that's a Malcolm McLaren, isn't it?
well, I wonder, could you maybe speak to like what the fuck happened to hippies now, because they're all conspiratorial anti-vax naturalists at this point. And does any of that?
I've had long COVID since April 2020.
Oh God, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, it's been really horrible. I couldn't read a book for like 18 months. This sort of thing. I mean, it's been really, it's been quite. I mean, I can blah blah quite easily.
Sure.
But, I became dyslexic basically, which is a bit worrying. But I've had, I'm not going to self pity, because I've had other people who've gone semi blind and all the rest of it. So yeah, there's other things going on. But yeah, that's I find very weird, that whole thing about. But that's a lot of it is the fear of the collective, isn't it? Again, you've got a good reason in America to be very dubious about big pharma.
I've spent the last 10 years living in Woodstock, New York, with all the remnants of the hippies from '69, and it was very surprising to me to see that these same activists who will prohibit and picket to prohibit a McDonald's from being placed in there, right? They will also picket to prohibit a stoplight or a cell tower from being erected there, right? So like there's still shoddy coverage. It's up in the mountains in Woodstock, right? But those same people that protest for that are the same people that are talking to you about 5G, are the same people that are who are telling waitresses that they're going to get breast cancer because they're wearing a smartwatch, and they're the same people who are anti-vaxxers, and a lot of them are like kind of affluent liberals as well, So
because they're in that bubble, aren't they? It's interesting because I saw this when I was ill. I was watching lots of YouTube documentaries, and this person's in rural Tibet and was pointing out that she had better cell phone, as you would call it, coverage than she had in New York.
Wow!
She said, look, they can get 5G in this. She said, I can't even get it in New York, or Silicon Valley. She said, actually, the 5G coverage is better than it was in Silicon Valley or something like that. But she was from New York. But I thought it was really funny. They say, the planner's state, We're not going to defend the CPC, but on the other hand, on certain things like they managed to save millions of lives through the lockdown policy.
If
you try to defend it, people go, "Oh no, you're in favour of totalitarianism." And I'm going, "Well, I've had this horrible disease for 3 years, and I think maybe sitting in the lockdown occasionally is probably quite until it mutated into a more benign form." Yeah. Among the barbarians, actually, I saw this great interview with the guy who actually persuaded the CPC leadership to lock down, and he basically said, "We're waiting till it mutates, till it's more or less, it's obviously still going to be harmful to some people, but much less dangerous." And then I thought, what he means is mutate among the barbarians outside the wall.
No, that's
a very
exactly,
Chinese way of looking at the world. I thought.
Well, I have to tell you, man, that like on this show, we've talked about like the kind of hippie / conspiracy crossover and where those two cultures merge.
Oh yeah, I think they do, but I think it's a lack of if you don't have class politics.
Yes,
it's really easy to fall into conspiracy because you haven't got another way of looking at the world. And one of the things they've very successfully done is break up the left. They've either co-opted it. They literally buy it out. I mean, look at the German Greens, who started off as an anti-war, anti-nukes party and anti-coal mines, and now they're pro-war, keeping open nuclear power stations and opening coal mines. That's because they've been bought basically by the Americans. And the other thing is you say it's like this. It's interesting how the empire buys the left. It buys its own opposition. And I said, I have personal experience here because my father was a running dog of American imperialism.
Right,
but it's amazing how systematic it is, because it's just. And the way that, now supposedly, according to Tucker Carlson, it's the left that's in favour of imperialist war and neoliberal austerity.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think your essay, honestly, like it helped shine a lot of clarity on how that sort of synthesis could even happen. Because I've spent some time like trying to decipher that on this show, and I've pointed to one other thing that was very helpful was the virtual class, as you call them, and how the virtual class has come to find the path to self-fulfillment through work itself. And this sort of like spiritual but not religious group in the United States is sort of grown in membership, right, to the point where
I wrote a really interesting pamphlet which I should send to you called the Class of the New, and it's about how for the last 200 or so years you always have like a group of people doing new things in new ways with new technologies, and they're seen like, or as I say in talking about imaginary futures, they're like the future in the present. And I think one of the Barbara Ehrenreich called them the professional managerial class. Well, they're not a class; they're a caste. Actually, I think is a more accurate description. But they are definitely that's definitely something that's really appeared. As I said, it's all those people who voted for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually had to apologise to a friend of mine who warned me that Biden would be worse than Trump, and I went, no, nothing can be worse. And then I had to write to her saying, "Oh dear, I admit that you were correct."
Man,
he is far worse than Trump. He actually started a war in Europe.
Right. So here's my last question for you, and I wonder, this is a little bit of a. I think I'm pulling from your essay stuff that is interesting to me, but I wonder, because it seems like the more society becomes secular, spiritual but not religious, we'll say, and the non-renewal of these sort of hippies that form this sort of convergence of the squares and the libertarian individualist Californian ideology, right? It's gotten to this thing where I feel like in society, the sort of apex of people who are in this ideology, like the apex is like self-actualization, self-fulfillment or something like the top of Maslow's pyramid, or the height of like sort of pursuit of fulfillment is the result is like authenticity, like maybe even like a Heideggerian sort of Dasein authenticity, and
invading Russia.
Well, not invading Russia, right? But like in a way, it's like
I think that's a rather unfortunate analogy at the moment, given what's going on in the Eastern Front.
Yeah. I mean, but I worry about things like Heidegger sticking around in philosophy, and I think that it was a natural turn in his philosophy to a degree that these questions of like who am I turn to like who are we.
I always remember this Slovene comrade saying he knew things were going wrong in Yugoslavia when the Serbian intellectuals stopped reading Marx and started reading Heidegger.
Is it accelerationism? The definition of acceleration is handing a Jim Bro into Jordan Peterson a copy of Being in Time. It's like it's
no,
like,
of course Marx is an accelerationist. If you read, especially if you read his, I mean, he's always anticipating things which are going to happen in 30 or 40 years. I mean, if you read Capital, it's a really amazing anticipation of factory production taking over the whole of capitalist society. But actually in 19th century England, Britain, where he's living, the biggest jobs were things like transport or domestic service. And actually the cotton factories, which Engels was working at and feeding him data from along with the factory inspectors, was actually a bit like Silicon Valley. It was like this sort of cutting edge bit of the economy. And then he said, oh, well, look at that. That's actually how it's going to happen. He anticipated the takeover of big government and big business, which is quite a spectacular piece of prophecy, given where he was living. So that you can do that. I think you do that. But I come back about this Californian ideal. It's just that because the book, the pamphlet is named after this book here, The German Ideology. This is the copy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.